Similar practices occurred in Northern Ireland during the 1970s. That's not so long ago, when Catholic women risked being tarred and feathered if they dated British soldier. The 1970s was a high time of political conflict between kind of Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, and the London politics that tried to, pacify the conflict. In some ways, those shaming practices resembled the locally administered practices of reproach and reprimand that had been so common during the early modern period. They too had been enacted by members of the local community who acted on behalf of and in accordance with a general moral economy. During the Nazi era, however, such practices enjoyed the tacit consent and permission of state authorities that only withdrew their consent once the local population turned against public exposure and shame processions. In socialist countries, shaming practices equally took place because the state wanted or even ordered them to be put in place. Public exposure was a powerful means of sanctioning unwanted behavior. For instance, the names of students or workers who did not perform well were written on banners displayed in schools or factory halls. Another measure used to punish and regulate citizens was a form of popular justice installed in factories but also in neighborhoods and peasants' cooperatives. Citizens who misbehaved by, for example, beating their wives or showing up for work drunk, such citizens were tried in front of and by their peers, which reportedly caused them enormous shame and embarrassment. In more liberal-minded states, such officially instigated policies of popular justice were taboo, since they were held to be inconsistent with notions of individual dignity and honor. At the same time, however, the state allowed social actors, especially and increasingly acting through the media, to blame and shame others, be it public figures or simple citizens. Such practices became more widespread around 1900. A famous example is this 1919 cover of a popular illustrated journal in Berlin, which deliberately ridiculed the new president, Social Democrat Friedrich Ebert, on the day he took his oath on the new Republican Constitution. A photograph taken at the Baltic Sea with Ebert and Noske, his Minister of Defense, which showed them, as you can see, which was absolutely never heard of during the imperial period. I mean, this very journal, the Berliner Illustrierte Zeitung, had printed kind of photographs of high officials and even the Kaiser on vacation, but they were always fully dressed with hats and stick, etc. Never, never, ever like that. Such policies gained further momentum during the Third Reich, when media directly served the interests of the fascist state. But they continued after the war, and right until our own times, with frequent incidents and effects of humiliation. In 2015, the tabloid Bild, that some of you might know, it's a kind of daily newspaper with 1.7 million copies sold every day and a huge online readership, So Bild in 2015 published what they called, deliberately called, a modern pillory. Pranger. They printed the names, portraits, and comments of people who had posted racist messages online. In a similar vein, citizens used the internet more and more to blame and shame others. Often, or well, always basically, allegedly for a good moral cause, because they're too fat, they drink too much, they don't pay their taxes, they use too much water, you name it. Have the wrong sexual orientation, etc. Public shaming here satisfies the needs of those who take the moral high ground and feel entitled to degrade others whom they consider morally inferior. The claim to superiority is equivalent to the claim to power that is demonstrated through practices of humiliating others, be it individuals or groups. Through the internet, such shaming practices have acquired a new dimension and quality. They spread quickly and extensively and expand the site of direct confrontation between the shaming and the shamed person beyond its spatial and social limits. Bullying certainly has a long tradition, especially in institutions such as the British boarding school or the military. Digital media, however, have lended a presence and a weight that by far exceeds the damage that it was able to inflict in the past. At the same time, such practices of public shaming, now enacted by all of us, basically, by each citizen, at least theoretically, coincided and collided with growing demands for respect and recognition. We encountered such demands already in the early 19th century, when liberal-minded citizens took offense at state policies meant to shame and dishonor those who had violated the law. We witnessed a similar awareness in 2012 with a young man who joined Sheena Harding during her public exposure in Cleveland, Ohio, thus denouncing the judge's decision to shame her for a traffic violation. I argue that such awareness has grown tremendously, mainly during the second half of the 20th century and in most Western societies. This was prepared by and facilitated by changes in education and upbringing. In former times, schools could generally be described as humiliation laboratories. Students, and I remember that from the 1960s in my West German school, students who disobeyed their teachers, sometimes did, and resisted discipline were punished by degradation. They were forced to stand in the corner with their backs to their classmates. Is that, don't we have the other one? See?
Oh no,
because, sorry, I actually wanted to show you here a famous sculpture, or a sculpture by a very famous West or German artist, Martin Kippenberger, who's about my age, and who in 1989 had done many sculptures where a man stands, a man, not a child, a man stands in the corner of a room, hands in his back, head bent, and the caption reads, Martin, up into the corner and be ashamed. So it's a kind of memory, well, both a memory of how he has been treated at school in the 1960s mainly, but it's also a hint towards what the art market did to him in 1989, but that's a different story. But it's a very, very famous and extremely expensive sculpture. Okay. So standing with their back to the classmates, but sometimes they had to wear, and that's actually a painting from France from the 1830s. They had to wear a donkey's cap to be made to look ridiculous. They received a public flogging, and I think we can see the next one now. Yeah, public flogging, that's what you see in the center of this 18th century engraving. But you also see, if you look to the, where is that? To the left, to your left, where the red circle is, you see a kid that also wears a hat, interestingly, and in order to punish him and to ridicule. Just in brackets. The same kind of hats were put on the heads of Chinese professors, teachers, public officials by the Red Guards in the Chinese Cultural Revolution, which still strikes me because it's so, you have even the same accessoires, the same tools, the same signs that are used to humiliate, in this case not kids but grown-ups. Okay. They received a public flogging and many more obnoxious punishments that were meant to shame and degrade them, the kids, in the eyes of their fellow students. Many generations of school teachers and pedagogues had spoken out in favor of such disciplining practices. They had vehemently dismissed the argument that the honor and dignity of young children and adolescents might be seriously harmed and violated by such treatment. Instead, they sang the praise of shaming as the ultimate means of habituating the young ones to social rules and conventions. And that's the argument that we've seen basically, long back to Plato.